There's a lot of loose talk about war crimes, especially when it comes to attacks on civilian infrastructure. But the law here is not vague. It's structured, and the distinctions are doing all the work. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. The governing framework here is international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, specifically Additional Protocol 1, and customary international law. At the center are three basic principles: distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. Let's start with distinction. You have to distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives, the same as you distinguish between civilians and combatants. Civilian infrastructure, power plants, bridges, water systems, are presumptively protected, but that protection is conditional. Civilian infrastructure becomes a lawful target if, and only if, it is actually being used for a military purpose and its destruction offers a definite military advantage. That's the legal standard. This isn't hypothetical, and it's not speculative. This is quite concrete. Now, look at rhetoric like Donald Trump's recent Truth Social post calling for Power Plant Day and Bridge Day in Iran. That language, taken at face value, and there's no reason not to take it at face value, is not targeting specific military uses of those structures. It's describing broad categories of civilian infrastructure as targets unto themselves. And that is the problem. International humanitarian law does not allow you to designate entire classes of civilian infrastructure as targets simply because destroying them would create pressure, disruption, or suffering. In fact, preventing suffering is the very purpose of the laws of armed conflict. Targeting civilian infrastructure for its own sake is not military necessity. It's coercion directed specifically at the civilian population, which is what the laws of armed conflict prohibit. Could a specific bridge or power plant be a lawful target? Absolutely. If it's actually being used for military purposes and the expected civilian harm is not excessive related to the military advantage, you can hit it all day and twice on Sunday. But Power Plant Day doesn't meet that standard. In fact, it's the opposite of it. It suggests targeting for effect, not for military necessity. There's a parallel here that actually helps clarify the rule. Just like civilian infrastructure can lose its protected status if it's used for military purposes, civilians themselves can lose their protected status, but only in a very specific and limited way. Again, under international humanitarian law, civilians are protected in a combat situation unless and for such time as they take direct part in the hostilities. That phrase matters, for such time. If a civilian picks up a weapon and actively participates in the fight, they can become a lawful target during that period. But the moment they disengage, they regain their protected status. Roughly the same logic applies to infrastructure. A bridge or a power plant doesn't become permanently targetable just because it exists or because it has some general connection to the war effort. It has to be making an actual effective contribution to military operations at the time of the attack. So the rule is consistent across both contexts. Protection is the default. It can be lost, but only under specific conditions and only for as long as those conditions exist. And that brings us to the parallel on civilian casualties. International law recognizes that civilians are sometimes killed incidentally during attacks on legitimate military targets. That is lawful, provided the attack was proportionate and precautions were taken to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties. But again, that is fundamentally different from deliberately targeting civilians as such. If civilians themselves are the object of the attack, that is a war crime. There's no balancing test that makes that lawful. So the through line here is straightforward. The law of armed conflict allows you to strike military objectives even when civilian harm is unavoidable, but it doesn't allow you to target civilian infrastructure or civilian populations for the sake of targeting civilian infrastructure or civilian populations. You don't get to target civilians or their infrastructure simply to break them, pressure them, or to make some kind of a point. Nor do you get to erase civilian status by category, either for buildings, bridges, or people. When you cross that line as a matter of practice or as a matter of openly stated policy, you're no longer talking about lawful warfare. And Donald Trump just took a big flying leap over the line. What we're talking about here is conduct that fits squarely within what international law defines as a war crime.